Good morning, everyone, and welcome to a new EBD seminar. I am Maria Jose Ruiz, and I'm going to be introducing our speaker today. And afterwards, I'll join Agus Camacho and Irene Mendoza to do the questions that you can write down in the chat. Also, if you need a certificate of attendance, please write down your email in the your name, in the chat, and then send an email to seminarios@ebd.csIC.es, so we know where we can send the email. So today we are really happy. We have with us Maria Paniw. She joined us recently with a Marie Curie Fellow. She did her PhD at the University of Cadiz, and she worked with endemic carnivorous plants in the Strait of Gibraltar. And she studied how populations respond to human disturbances. In particular, she looked at fire suppression. Then she moved to a postdoc to University of Zurich, where she did demographic modeling for different animal systems. And then she came back to Spain to work in the CRIAF with the Juan de la Cierva Fellowship. And then now she joined us with the Marie Curie at EBD. Her research focuses on how environmental factors, biotic interactions, and individual traits interact to determine population structure and dynamics. Most recently, her research tried to integrate multi-species seasonal population dynamics into a comprehensive framework. Welcome, Maria, and you can start whenever you are ready.
Okay. I hope everything is fine. You hear me, right? Because I cannot see.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Sorry, the standard Zoom question. Okay, so thank you very much, Maria Jose, for this wonderful introduction. And a special thanks to all the organizers of this fantastic seminar series and the speakers that have previously given talks. I really enjoyed those talks. And I'm really looking forward to interacting with you later on through comments and questions in the chat. Now, I will start with sort of stating the obvious, and that is that we live in an era defined by vast challenges to us ecologists, in an era defined by huge biodiversity losses, where for an increasing larger number of taxa across plants and animals, natural populations are either going extinct altogether or are dramatically decreasing in size. And we are in an urgent need of new ideas and new frameworks to be able to robustly project or forecast the fate of species and biodiversity in new spatial and temporal contexts. And it is in this background where ecological forecasting has sort of emerged as an important discipline in ecology. And this is something that I do primarily now that interests me a lot in my research. And I here just show you a bit of a sketch so that we're all on the same page, and sort of a sketch of what ecological forecasting does, at least the way most of us understand it and apply it in ecology. Essentially, we take certain patterns that are of interest to us and look at their behavior in the past and present, and try to link these patterns to some drivers. And then we project typically the drivers into the future, in this case, and try to, in turn, project how the patterns of interest change. And our forecasts are typically quite uncertain, necessarily so due to many reasons, and they are more so uncertain the farther along in the forecasting horizon we go. Now, one main goal of forecasting has become to be able to decrease this uncertainty and to produce more robust and more varied and more nuanced results of our analyses of the patterns we're interested in. And one way to achieve so is, for instance, to be able to link our patterns of interest to more drivers. And in this case, we may think that, for instance, the abundance of this one species, the one population, is affected by complex interactions among environmental drivers. And understanding some of these interactions may be important to give us different scenarios of the future fate of this population of species. And of course, the axis over which we're projecting does not have to be time. And we don't necessarily always look at abundance. This is just something more familiar to me, but we certainly can look at any other response across many species, natural communities, and entire ecosystems. But the point is that we really need to make more robust forecasting, in part because these robust projections can really allow us to set biodiversity targets of how much biodiversity we're willing, or how much species we're willing to lose under certain environmental scenarios, very much like a greenhouse gas scenarios, so greenhouse gas emissions, which are based on very robust climate models, right? So that's the idea. However, we are in ecology, and unfortunately, the biological systems are very complex, and the type of projections we make, the observations we make, or we think will happen to biological systems often do not come true. There's a lot of controversies involved. And essentially, we are still pretty bad at contextualizing our findings, either scaling them up or down, depending on the research we're doing. So we're bad at getting the context right. And I think I'll show you one example of where this has occurred recently. This is a famous paper that's been hotly debated on the global tree restoration potential, essentially where the authors try to project how tree planting around the globe will allow us to sequester carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and help fight climate change. And there's been a lot of debate about the certainty of these projections, and the authors themselves acknowledge that their forecasts are characterized by high uncertainty and really only show the potential and not, not what we can actually realize. And in part, this uncertainty lies with the fact that their models do not consider important life history processes among the trees. And there's a lot of literature showing that these life history processes are quite important. If you want understanding these processes is very important if you want to understand how trees will behave under climate change. So life history trade-offs between survival and reproduction, and growth and survival, and so forth. And in fact, this is just one example of many where it's shown that in order to better contextualize our finding, we need to look at the life history and demographic context. And this may make intuitively sense because ultimately all life on Earth is determined by the universal processes of surviving, dying, and reproducing. And all taxa have evolved various strategies to optimize their rates of survival and reproduction to respond to their environment. So to have definite strategies, life history strategies of how they respond to the environment. And there's this fantastic paper that I've been lucky to collaborate on and just came out 2 days ago, which sort of shows some of the first evidence, quantitative evidence, that in plant species, so the dots on the plot are different populations of different plant species, and for these populations, the generation time, which defines the fast-slow continuum life history among plants, is actually quite an important predictor of how much populations are affected by changes in precipitation or other climatic drivers. So the life history does determine response to the environment, and accounting for life history has been shown to improve our ability to forecast. In addition, something that I have been working on, we see that within a given life history, demographic responses to the environment are very complex themselves, whether we speak about short-lived or long-lived species. And here, this is a paper that will come out shortly in a few weeks. And we essentially, it was a large collaborative effort, and we essentially looked at all mammal species and trying to find studies where people looked holistically how demographic rates across the life cycle respond to climate drivers. And we found studies for 87 species that you see distributed on this map here. Some of the species are highlighted, but essentially one main finding of the study is that our interpretation of what will happen under climate change to a certain population very much depends on whether we're looking at survival, reproduction, growth, on what life cycle stage we're looking, and on whether we do or do not incorporate or account for interactions among different environmental drivers, biotic factors, and so forth. So the demographic context is quite complicated, which then in turn scales up to complicate our inferences on population changes under climate change. And once we sort of accept the fact that demography and life history are important to account for when we do forecasts, we may want to focus on species persistence. We may want to ask ourselves, okay, so how can we do it? And obviously, population ecology has sort of been the mother discipline of these types of forecasts, because the earliest studies, population viability studies, from the 1980s and so forth, are the ones that really look at detailed demographic information across systems and try to project how, based on this information, how the species will fare under different scenarios of some changes, typically associated with human pressures. And it's really nice because for an increasing number of species, we actually started to have very detailed and good demographic data on, for instance, survival and reproduction across different life cycle stages, even on individual traits, such as body mass or fur color, and many other things. And there are little limitations, but we do have quite nice and increasingly more usable data that's also being collected in open repositories that allow us to do a lot of comparative studies. And that's fantastic. And so we can use this data to do really nice environmental forecasts. But one issue that I found in my own research and other publications is that when we project population dynamics through time, we rarely ever account or simultaneously project species interactions. And this is despite the fact that species interactions can have a very strong effect on their underlying demographic rates, which we use to project. So the only thing that we typically project is the density dependence of the intraspecific density dependence. This is the only type of interactions we typically look at. But for this imaginary outpopulation, we would rarely consider what happens to potential competitors or to the prey under future climate change or global change scenarios, right? So I wanted to know in my own research, and this is something I'm focusing on more and more, is how important is it to account for biotic interactions? And I want to show you on one wonderful study system how much this actually matters and how much this can influence our inference of species fates under climate change in this case. So I will talk a little bit about my research on the Kalahari meerkats, which I have started when I went to the University of Zurich on my postdoc. And I have been very lucky to collaborate with this fantastic project, the Kalahari Meerkat Project, that's where the study is conducted in the Kalahari Desert in South Africa. And this is an ongoing study since 1996, where we have very detailed data on over 3,000 meerkats, individuals, that have been followed almost daily for over 25 years. And originally, this data have been collected to answer questions of the evolution of sociality. And when I went to Zurich and already before, we started to repurpose this data to answer global change questions. And why would we want to do that? Well, it's because meerkats live in these very harsh, unpredictable desert environments. And you can see, for instance, what having or not having rain in a given month between 2 years can do to the habitat and hence food availability for the meerkats. And importantly, in the study system and for arid systems in general, climate change is projected to have severe impacts on many aspects of the systems. And however, these are still sort of understudied compared to more temperate systems where we have more data from. So we set out to model this very detailed demography of meerkats as a function of many factors, including climate, And then we used IPCC climate change projections to project climate change, and then thereby the population persistence of this one species, or this one population we're studying. And essentially, we came out with very nice, interesting results that show that interactive effects of rainfall and temperature extremes, increases in these extremes, may really increase the quasi-extinction or the almost extinction of the meerkat population in time, based on greenhouse gas emission scenarios that you can see here in different colors. And so this is just one result of the study, and we also showed a bunch of mechanisms that explain the potential extinction of the local population or its persistence. And importantly, we really, this was the first mechanistic forecast of an arid environmental specialist, and did give us a good idea of the severe risks climate risks that arid systems may face. And that's great, but we came up with a bit of a challenge here. And that is, if you look at the observed population densities in black, and so this is number of individuals per square kilometer, and then you compare the observed with the projected, which is based on our demographic models, and you see them in green, you see that we're doing pretty well, given the complexity of the data and the system. We've done pretty well in projecting for most of the, or replicating the observed data for most of the time, except here towards the end of the study, where the population did almost collapse, but we were just too conservative. We could not capture this collapse. And it's worth noting that every time the population did decrease, it was due to some environmental drought event, including here in 2013 and later, and this was a pretty bad drought event. But this by itself, and we accounted for that in the models, this by itself did not really explain why our projections were a bit off here. So we started thinking, and eventually we started thinking, okay, what about disease dynamics? That is, tuberculosis is a disease that affects meerkats and has always been in the population. But it did appear that around this time, quite a few of the really old, large established groups have succumbed to tuberculosis, have failed because of tuberculosis. So we were wondering, okay, is it important, or how important is it to incorporate tuberculosis into our demographic models? And how would that change our interpretation of what may happen to the population under climate change? The reason we were thinking of tuberculosis so much is that, so there is this endemic TB strain in the groups of meerkats, and as fatal one symptoms appear. And it's interesting because the symptoms that you can see here on the photo, which are lumps essentially that appear all over the body, and they burst, and once they burst, the individuals die within a short time frame of a few months. And so these symptoms affect adults disproportionately, which are also the sort of the life history stage which contributes most to group dynamics. Excuse me. And importantly, TB is the main cause of mortality in larger established groups. And that's important because larger established groups are the ones that keep the population together, essentially. Why? Because they are buffered from, or more or less buffered from environmental effects, for instance, drought or severe cold or severe heat, and so forth. And whereas small groups are very much inclined to fail stochastically, just simply due to chance events of 1 or 2 individuals dying. And then these more buffered large groups are the sources that can allow new groups to establish. So when these fail, the entire population becomes very much unstabilized. Okay, so with that in mind, we sort of went back to the demographic models we had, reparameterized them a bit at the group level to look at individual groups, and incorporated tuberculosis. And we did an individual-based model to scale from individual behavior to group dynamics. And I will show you some of the one simulation result of this model. And so that you can follow, just a heads up, so you will see some dots which represent resident individuals in a group, and the larger dots are for adults, and the tiny dots are for juveniles and pups, so all individuals. And you see, when you see a square, that's a male immigrating into a group. And when the group is all green, it means that there are no individuals with TB symptoms. But when the group switches to red, it means that one individual, at least one individuals were shown to have TB symptoms, upon which we characterized the entire group as TB symptomatic, which was for us, due to lack of knowledge on transmission pathways, was the most robust way we could parameterize these models. So you see the group going through life, individuals being all happy, some are born, the ones that are born sometimes die, and you know, everything is green, the group is relatively large, right? And then eventually this immigrant appears, bam, there he is, and the group goes red, has tuberculosis. And you see very quickly there's fewer and fewer adults left, so much so that by month 55, we consider this group failed because there's only one adult left and a few juveniles. These will die. This is a male, and the male will disperse and likely die doing so. So you see, one thing you can see that TB is spread by migration, so by intergroup contact, and in this case by the immigrant male coming into a group. And the second thing you see is that TB leads quickly to group failure. And so that's what I already suggested before. And the question is now, okay, what does this have to do with climate change? Well, it turns out that increases in temperature and precipitation temperature regimes don't actually directly affect the likelihood that a group becomes TB symptomatic. But what these weather extremes and climate change does is actually destabilize local group dynamics and making individuals more mobile. So you have more males coming into groups, which bring TB, which then causes TB in the group and leads to group failure. So here we show sort of very strong indirect effects of climate change on group persistence, and particularly persistence of large group, because again, all these indirect effects accumulate much more strongly in large groups, whereas small groups just often fail stochastically way before TB or climate change can get them. And because these indirect effects affect the most important parts of the population, they really destabilize population dynamics. And importantly, these indirect effects through disease dynamic of climate change are much stronger than more direct effects through food changes in food abundance or physiological stresses that climate change may cause. And interestingly, these sort of dynamics between TB, movement of individuals, and effects of climate are not unique to meerkats, have been observed in other systems, most importantly in European badgers that also have TB problems. And this suggests that indirect climate change effects via disease dynamics may be very likely very widespread in social species, and is something we really need to start looking at. And one last thing before I sort of move on with the talk is that I often get the question, okay, is it really necessary to do such a very complicated model where you do individual-based behavior and dynamics and scale it up to the entire population? Can't you just look at changes in group size? And we tried to do that with a student of mine who's collaborating with me, and Fran, an undergraduate student, and he's sort of tried to replicate the analyses, but without going into demographic mechanisms, and just sort of looking at modeling group size as a function of environment and tuberculosis and so forth. And it actually turns out to be very difficult. And so these are projections of group sizes across months under various climate change scenarios. And it turns out it's very difficult to replicate these results that we have from individual-based models if you look very phenomenologically just at changes in group size. And this is because the way that climate and TB affects individuals and then scales up to group effects is very complex and nonlinear. And so we need to understand the demographic context in this case, and probably in many, many other cases. Okay, so if you go back to our sketch population ecology with this imaginary owl, we can conclude from this case study, which has very good detailed data, that species interactions are important if you want to understand or be better at forecasting the potential problems natural populations may face under climate extremes. But of course, then you may ask yourself, okay, so how can I incorporate more holistically interactions of species into forecasting? And one thing that we can look on at is community ecology, because network ecologists that work with networks, or coexistence theory, because these types of fields have been really, really good at characterizing species interactions into the sort of interaction matrices, perturbing these matrices, and giving us good information on species persistence if interactions are perturbed. So this is great. However, in many of these types of more community-wide estimates or forecasts of species persistence, we lack the demographic mechanisms. So we know there's an owl population, and we know how the competitors in food affects it, say, but we don't know anything about the population structure of these owls, for example. So I thought, wouldn't it be great if you could actually do really mechanistic forecasts of several species interacting demographically with each other, building a community in a simplified manner, but building a community and projecting how these communities may respond to environmental change. And with that in mind, I wrote a project that was funded by the Marie Curie, and is the reason why I'm at the EBD now, where I wanted to look closer at the feedbacks between demography and species interactions, and under what circumstances, so in what types of communities, and how, through which demographic pathways, do they impact species responses to one important aspect of climate change, which is seasonality change. So these are big words and a lot of wording that I'm using. And let me just show you what I'm trying to do with an example. Essentially, because there's very little natural systems I can answer these questions with that have the type of detailed data I need. The very first step I wanted to do in this project was to simulate communities, and which would then allow me to pose hypotheses and ask questions that I can test with empirical data sets, right? And you don't have to go into detail. You don't have to understand the detail of this slide very much, but it's sure just to give you an overview of the simulations of spatially explicit multi-species population models I'm trying to do. And essentially you have here 3 species occupying 2 sites and being able to move among the sites. And each of these species, the demography of each of these species is characterized by seasonal matrix population models, where the transition among stages in different seasons is determined by demography. And the demography is itself dependent on the environment, on the intraspecific density, and on various interspecific densities, so incorporating species interactions. Now, by perturbing these betas, I can perturb demography, and I can create different kinds of communities, which then can be perturbed under climate change scenario to see what happens to them. And this is just an example of a community that I may get, right? So here you have the distribution of the abundance of juvenile, non-reproductive, reproductives among the 3 species I'm looking at in a simplified community across 2 sites for different simulation years. And these species differ in key life history metrics, so like generation time and net reproductive rate. And you can create all kinds of different communities. And my idea was to create communities where the species differ in their life histories, more or less strongly, differ in the relative strengths of interspecific interactions, and live in either homogeneous or heterogeneous habitats. And then I can expose these communities to climate change, do a fully mechanistic forecast where I consider all the interactions and all the seasonal demography of all the 3 species, and I can compare these fully mechanistic forecasts to simplified ones the ones we typically do in real world. So let me show you an example of this. So here you have, say, this top predator that we're looking at. It doesn't have to be a lynx, it can be anything. And we have, let's say, instead of going fully mechanistics in our forecasts, we have the scenario where we know the seasonal demography of the predator. We have no idea about the mesopredator, potential competitors. And we do understand that prey affects the demography of this predator, but we model the prey only looking at its abundances, not looking closely at the demographic context of the prey species. So just assuming that the prey abundance is a function of the environment and nothing else. So what happens? Okay, so here you have as a baseline sort of the mechanistic full forecast. And the x-axis here are sort of different communities that vary based on interaction strengths and how seasonal interactions are. And these communities are either in homogeneous or heterogeneous habitats. And the response here is one among many, which is mean abundance of the predator. And you see that when you do simplified assumptions, so the ones shown here, you really overestimate the impact of climate change on this predator. Why? Mainly because you are omitting important competitive interactions, and also because you're overestimating the abundance of prey by not modeling it as a function of the predators in the system, right? So there is a risk here of simplifying and that we're becoming overly optimistic of what may happen to the species. For the prey, for instance, we can also look at what happens when we simplify. And one simplification that's always done, mostly done in population modeling, for instance, is that we do know the seasonal demography of the focal species, but we just completely ignore the predators. We know nothing about them, say. They're just incorporated as random noise in our models. And here again, we have the same outline as before. And if you compare just the green to the orange violent plots, you see that once again, we are overestimating the abundance of the prey. And this leads me to conclude that if we ignore species interactions in seasonality change forecasts in this case, you really are at risk of underestimating negative effects of climate change. And for the predator, in addition, as we ignore the demographic context of the prey here, we are also putting like an additional strain on our ability to forecast population dynamics of this species. So these are, and again, these are results that I'm currently writing up, and which I want to test on empirical systems. And you see here a bit on the left some of the actual systems I will be working with. So global collaborations, it's fantastic and gives us a lot of opportunities. But you may also wonder, well, Maria, what you're doing is just of population ecology on steroids. You don't really like look at the community. Why? Because you're not incorporating this very complex interaction matrix that is probably occurring in natural systems. So the rabbit, for instance, here may have a bunch of competitors you're not accounting in your three-species model. And it's true, but I think it's an important step to recognize how very important key interactions affect our forecasts. And on the other hand, I am trying to go more into the community level arena of forecasting by collaborating with proper coexistence theorists, and so Oscar Godoy and David Garcia Callejas, who have developed this fantastic R package where they model species coexistence based on interaction matrices. And we are planning to expand this a bit to see how results may differ or not based on how we incorporate the demographic, based on incorporating the demographic context, so the stage structure of interacting species. It's a complicated multidimensional problem, so let's see if we succeed. So with this, I would like to conclude. And I would like to just say that I think, to solve many global change issues, we really need to be better at linking various disciplines together and integrate data to not create some sort of monster of forecasting. So we need to get better at our own thinking and export ideas and collaborate more. And we do have a lot of, so this is not something that I just invented, but something that's been suggested over and over again in the recent past. And we really have the necessary tools to do many of the integrative analyses that we need. And I just want to here highlight some of the work the PhD students I'm collaborating with, some of them are doing. For instance, Anna, who's trying to integrate various data sets from the literature to model wolf dynamics under global change. And Eva, who is working at the University of Zurich, and who is trying to incorporate a lot of spatial information to model lion dynamics, so changes in lion populations and packs under global change. So with that, I want to thank all my mentors, collaborators, the students, and all the helpers that have been working with me in the field and in the lab, doing analyses. Thank you all very much, and thank you all for listening. I am done.
Thank you so much, Maria, for your talk. That was super cool, super promising. So I'm gonna check if there are questions in the chat. Yes, so we have the first question from Nacho Bartumeus.
Yes.
And he says, I really like your in silico approach. I wonder if you can answer how strong have to be the interactions to change the forecasting. Because I'm assuming that the strength of the interaction is a strong assumption.
Yes, yes. Yes, that's something I've been struggling with a bit. Let me go back to this initial slide here where I show the simulated communities. So when you can just see from this one slide the multidimensionality monster that this is, right? So my brain would explode if you would try to simulate all kinds of interactions among all kinds of variables. And in fact, when you look, there's always frameworks coming out of how we should model global change and integrate things. And then it's always said, well, interactions are super important. And then there's always a comment, we can model them because it's too multidimensional. So sorry, it's not, it's never going to happen. So I try to not be discouraged by this. And so what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to model sort of realistic things based on the literature, right? So I'm not necessarily trying to compare, sort of doing like a gradient of strong versus weak interactions, and then compare how they respond to global change. I just want to get discrete communities that are realistic in this natural world that we live in, and perturb them, and just be able to say sort of, okay, if the interactions are relatively strong, it matters. If not, it doesn't matter. So be more discrete sort of in this type of approaches. That's the only way I can think of solving this. And yes, there are many assumptions, and that's why I want to test them with empirical data. That's the only way to solve some of these issues or some of the questions. I don't know if this helps in answering.
Okay, but what I see from your model is that the way you introduce interactions is with the density of the populations, no? It's the only way, no? You're not saying which kind of interaction it is, no? If it's positive or negative.
Of course, yes, because the better, yes. I mean, the interactions, I give here plus, sorry.
Okay.
It's just but the beta can be negative, right? So for instance, if it's, and I should, by the way, not say rabbit, it should say like fox-rabbit, interaction between fox and rabbits. What I'm doing is that the betas can be, of course, negative. So like for the rabbit itself, the effect of density of rabbits is actually negative. So I give it the magnitude and I give it the sign, of course, yes, to see whether they're positive or negative.
Okay, I see. So there is another question by Justine Lebanon. She says, great work, thank you for the talk. What models did you use to make projections of the population density? And are these models included, do these models include any evolutionary response of the population as IPM models? Did you test the differences according to the projection and observation?
So if you are talking about this stuff, no, I have not incorporated evolutionary mechanisms yet. The only thing I am looking at is, like I said, life history parameters like generation time. Mm-hmm. And by sort of tracing it, it can give me an idea of the sort of selection pressures that may exist if I perturb the communities, but I'm not explicitly accounting for evolutionary aspects. I'm not. This is something I may want to do in the future, but I cannot currently. It's beyond, it's too complex to incorporate now. In the real examples that I showed, like the meerkats and some of the other systems I'm working on, yes, we've been doing IPMs, and we use body mass as sort of the trait of interest. So yes, there we have looked. I mean, we haven't explicitly incorporated inheritance, but at least we have looked at how body mass may change based on climate change scenarios. So yeah.
Okay, thank you. Wow, you have a lot of questions. Now it's Monse Vila. So Monse is saying, very interesting, Maria. I guess the 1 million question is how much detailed demographic data you need to have for a robust forecast, and how, for instance, how long the time series?
Thank you for that question. In fact, I want to prove with this Marie Curie that you do not need like the super detailed individual based data to answer many of the questions. For instance, I have this little image of the ungulates here. What we have are changes in abundances of ungulates from which we can use available tools, and we can, the magic is the Bayesian latent variable models. We can infer demography and make them interact. So I think, of course, and ideally you would need decades of data, depending on the life history. There's some work that's been shown that you need like 15 years of data to do robust climate change models. But there are space for time substitutions. There is a lot of data actually sitting out there that people have used for quite different purposes and never even thought of doing demographic models, like the meerkats. They had all this data, but initially it was all about sociality. And now we've gone into the global change aspects, and now researchers there are trying to combine the data sets. I think there's much more data than we think there is. We just need to be able to integrate it and use the tools to do so. But yeah, and we need to collect more data. It's like that. Spend long-term research is important. Yes.
Yeah, this is the eternal complex paradox of getting long-term studies that they are never always funded. So.
Right? Yeah, I mean, I'm now, for instance, I'm reviewing and there was the NSF grants, I think one of them for the US, that they actually have categories specific for long-term research. So they fund like 10-year projects. If you can show that it's, and I think it's important, that's just key. I mean, the value of these long-term data sets is unbelievable. Of all the questions you can answer with them. It's well worth the effort, I think.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. So now there are 3 questions from Miguel Fortuna. I'm going to ask you all in a whole, and then you can go back one by one. And if you need to have a repetition, you can tell me. Miguel says, thank you for the talk. I have 3 questions. The first one is, does the mean abundance of the species in your predictions represent the arithmetic or the geometric mean? The second question is, what is the relationship between the accuracy of your predictions and the variance of the response variables, for instance, population abundance? And the third question is, would you say that the number of species in a community promotes or hinders our ability to predict changes in population abundances? So I can repeat if you need.
Yeah, I remember number 1 and 3.
Okay, the one is the type of mean.
First one. I will answer the first one. I think it was I'm using here the geometric mean, I think. but this is not it. I'm not just focusing all my results on this one aspect. So I'll calculate all kinds of results from this simulations, sort of multidimensional results. I do the CV, I do the seasonality of abundance. I do stage-specific abundances. So I'm trying to look at various aspects of this, not just the abundance and extinction risk, for instance, and all of these. Well, the number of species and how they influence. I don't know. I mean, this is one of the things I'm trying to answer with this project by having trying to collaborate with people and including a lot of species. I think that ultimately for these types of models and this GLM frameworks that you throw everything in, like the mixed effect models, you have sort of key variables, so key interactions that are driving everything, and then smaller interactive or additive effects of other variables. And unless you have of other interactions, and unless you have very detailed data and very long-term data where you can pick up extremes in these small effects, they probably won't matter so much. So it probably will be all determined by some key interactions in the system. I would say our ability, I think, you know, our ability is so la la. It's we don't need to understand all the complexity of the systems. It would be great, but I would just start in understanding the most important interactions.
Yeah. In any case, you only use like a few number of species, right?
Yeah, species, and that's already like, I mean, that's already a headache to try to understand and put together, and that's just simulations. So
yeah.
Anyway, the second question, sorry, I totally.
So I can repeat to you. So what is the relationship between the accuracy of your predictions and the variance of the response variables such as population abundance?
I do not know how to answer this question.
Maybe you can try for the next.
It's all a simulation, so I can make it as accurate as you like. I don't know. I'm not sure. Please email me if you would like to discuss this further. I do not know how to answer this now.
Okay, for sure, he will do that. So Cayetano Gutierrez Canovas, he's also thanking you for the talk. He says, I enjoy and learned a lot. I have two questions. The first one is, do you think it is feasible to apply this framework to more diverse community, for instance, invertebrates? So this is something similar to the previous one.
Of course, invertebrate. I mean, so let me just go back to this very initial slide. So we set out, when I talked about this large-scale collaborative work of mine, so we did this review on mammal population responses to climate. We thought, oh, we'd find a lot of studies. Turns out there's actually very few studies. There's very few studies on very few species, and mammals are like among the most studied groups ever, right? I mean, if you know, it's birds and mammals. If you know something about climate demography relationships, is for these two groups. We already have very little information for mammal species. I mean, if you just look, there's like Russia is completely an empty. It's just nothing exists apparently. You know, South America. Let's not even go there, right? I mean, we just many of these and many of the studies you find here are repeatedly done on the same system over and over again. Like as you see exemplified with me and the meerkats, just you have this great system, just keep churning out, you know, nice papers. Invertebrates are a complete. There's just nobody has any idea about their demography. At least that's what invertebrate people tell me. So please. I stand corrected. So I think, that, of course, it's you can. Yes, you just need to find tools good tools how to measure demography, to link interacting species. It's absolutely possible. I believe so. Yeah.
But I guess, Maria, also the question was about the fact that you can, if you include too many species in the matrices, it's gonna be impossible, too complex to handle, right?
Yeah. Yes. Absolutely. It's what I'm saying. This is why everyone always doesn't even. Many people don't even try because they say it's too multidimensional. I say you don't have to incorporate everything. You just have to incorporate the most important interactions. That's already better than not doing it at all, right? This is what I'm saying. It's like look at species interactions. They're super important, but you don't have to be so poof. There's too much anyway, so ignore them.
Okay. His second question is: do you expect that the importance of biotic interactions change if we consider more complex communities? Thanks again.
I suppose, like, yeah, if you're talking about more direct interactions, yes, of course, yes. But that's something that I'm trying to work on with Oscar and David to look at it more from this complex interaction matrix and how adding demography changes our interpretation. But yes, I would say so. But I cannot make definitive answers because it really hasn't. So these types of things haven't been tested much. So let's find out through collaboration. Okay. Yes.
So I have a personal question, and then I think my colleagues also would like to ask you more things. So my question is, can you do the opposite? Can you predict the interaction if there? I mean, can you forecast if the interaction is gonna happen or not, including your models? I mean, using your models of demography and climate change, for instance. That is really my interest, no? To see if there is gonna be an interaction with a new scenario, climatic scenarios, or not.
With this type of GLMs, I doubt it, because they would imply that you sort of add a new parameter or you change the value of the certain parameter in new context. But that's the only thing you change. Like, you assume that the interaction strength, so whatever you have is remains as is, and you just change the predictors, right? The more or less density. So with these types of frameworks, probably not. But there are many analyses that do, for instance, species co-occurrence models, where you can infer interactions from these. So they do. I know they do exist, but I also know there's been a bit of criticism of these, which I don't want to go into, because people say it's very difficult to infer interactions unless you test them. So likely it'll be difficult in any framework. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
I wanted to also make a couple of questions from my point of view. Maria, I'm super interested in this topic that you're tackling here, and I address it more from the perspective of the physiology of species, but for me, more specifically on how the mismatch between the physiology of a species and the environment creates changes in demography or habitat use, etc., geographic distribution. My question here was always, well, since the species don't live alone, understanding their interaction with other species or diseases, etc., which are also species, are going to affect this demography and everything. What you're showing here is a very, very complex model to try and elucidate that for at least one group or one delimited community, right?
Yeah.
Do you think that it is possible to identify more constant, to identify parameters within this model that would allow us to predict the outcome of interactions across large geographic scales? Because what I mean is, in some cases, you want to know this for a specific group of species, species or social group.
Yes.
But sometimes you want to make predictions for a country or for a region like Andalusia or something like that.
Yes.
Do you think it is possible to find something like that?
I think yes. Like my gift, yes with an if. Yes. So yes. You could of course find generalities, because again, like, so what I'm trying to set up is sort of a framework where you can create all kinds of different communities, simplified, but all kinds of different, and then you can vary them based on things that are theoretized or that have shown to be important, like the life history, for instance, right? So there you could say, okay, if you have so and so many interacting species, and they interact negatively and positively and so on, and they have certain life history differences, then we would predict sort of an overall outcome to be this. You can do that. But this would be very general predictions, as is always the case, that may not be applicable to specific context that you want. But yes, I mean, the idea behind creating this framework is to provide these types of general predictions, right, and hypotheses. Yes, depending on how general you would like, I think it's very much possible. I would hope so. And there are quite a few studies now that show generalized outcomes of species interactions. So it's possible to incorporate these into the current framework, yes. But I cannot give it that definite answer. I find these types of answers to be very difficult to state. I don't know, because it seems like context dependency always wins out in the end.
Exactly. That context dependency
I try to tell you, yeah, sure, you can generalize, but then you generalize and you realize that the context is actually, maybe this is a generalization, that context dependency is very important. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, but how to address that, right? Like how to reach to a situation in which we say, okay, so we know the context is this one determined by the climate and the species set that are interacting, and then in this case you're going to have this outcome of interspecific interactions, and in this one you're going to have another one. Like, yeah,
I think you could at least a very generalized outcome, like I say, you can do based on the theory, on life history, on interaction strengths. You could get to these types of conclusions, but they will be very general. Is my thing, yeah. And if it's about specific management applications, I don't know if these sort of generalized conclusions are enough. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe that's the way to go. Maybe we using these complex models to specific communities or specific social groups, etc. Yeah. But then try to use simplified models to try and create predictions at larger scales. Maybe, I don't know. Well, I think with climate, they're doing what you do, I guess, but they apply what you do to every pixel of a map, right? Of a raster map.
Yeah. The climate is a good example. I mean, biological systems are so much more complex.
Are they?
I think so, yes. It's a thing you could argue about. I would say so, yes. A lot of non-linearities that go in there, but
they are pretty damn complex.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Marie.
No, thank you for the questions and for organizing the series. Thank you.
So I also have a question. Sure. You've covered a lot of modeling, you've answered a lot of modeling questions, so mine is way more simple than that. I would like to go back to the meerkat example where you showed us the graph looking at the prediction and the observed patterns in the population.
Yes, coming, yes.
So when you were, I was interested in knowing whether, but you were pointed out here that drought were like the reason why these populations declines were happening over time. Was tuberculosis also linked to the other two drought events?
No, no. So because the quick answer is no, because it turns out that tuberculosis or that climate does not, or at least the way we measure this, climate in these models does not directly affect tuberculosis or the probability of groups showing TB symptoms. There's no direct effect, not much. There's a bit of sort of an indication that temperature may be important, but the effect was very, very small. So tuberculosis is largely determined by social interactions.
Yes.
And climate in turn has effect on these interactions.
In these interactions.
Yeah. That's why.
So I guess my question is, to define if there were tuberculosis outbreaks as well during the other droughts.
Yes. So the thing is, tuberculosis has been there always. So it's not just, so it's kind of an
endemic
population, and it pops up, pops down, pops up. So it's not, it's not like it just appears. There's nothing, it bomb, it beeps. It's endemic in the groups, right? It's just that it's what I at least thought is problematic when it really kills the large groups, when it, you know, when it gets to the larger groups. So this is where I thought I was speculating a bit here, and this is why I incorporated tuberculosis into the models, essentially.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
I don't know if you guys have more questions, Agus or Irene?
Not on my part. Thank you very much, Maria Paniw.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. And I hope that we can discuss more for you on your projects. I think this is super enriching for the rest of the EBD. So thank you so much for this talk. And next week, we're going to have a break for the Easter time. So the next one, the following week, we will have another seminar by Ana Benítez López. So thank you so much and goodbye.